welcome to the second episode of Memory and Valour, a podcast dedicated to resurrecting the individual stories and quiet sacrifices of Canadian veterans. I'm your host, Samantha McRae. Thank you for joining me at the crossroads where memory and valor meet. Before we really get started, I want to dedicate this episode to the memory of Dr. Tim Cook, Canada's preeminent military historian, author, and chief historian at the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa. I didn't know Dr. Cook personally, but his work has profoundly shaped my understanding of the First World War. The first book of his I ever read was called Lifesavers and Body Snatchers. It was personal, compelling, and deeply grounded in history. Through his writing, he gave voice to the soldiers, nurses, stretcher bearers, and doctors who endured unimaginable hardship, and he did so with empathy and clarity. Dr. Cook joined the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa in 2002, serving first as its First World War historian and later as chief historian and director of research. Over more than 2 decades, he curated landmark exhibitions such as Victory 1918 to the Last 100 Days, Communities at War, and War in Medicine. He also championed oral history projects that preserve the voices of veterans and their families, which is absolutely amazing and fantastic and probably my favorite modality when it comes to telling history. His work ensured that the museum was not just a place full of artifacts, but it was a living space of memory. Beyond the museum, Tim Cook authored 19 books, including At the Sharp End, Shock Troops, Vimy, The Battle and the Legend, and The Secret History of Soldiers. His scholarship earned him national awards and international recognition, but more importantly, it made Canada's wartime past accessible and human. Dr. Cook passed away less than a month ago at the age of just 54. His loss is deeply felt, but his legacy endures in the stories he told and the history he preserved. So this episode of Memory and Valor is dedicated to him, Dr. Tim Cook, a historian who gave us the gift of remembrance and whose work continues to inspire us to listen to the voices of the past. The war was a machine, a great, grinding, endless machine designed to consume bodies. It chewed up men in the thousands. At the Somme, at Passchendaele, at Vimy Ridge, for every life lost, 10 more were shredded, gassed, shattered. But within that monstrous machine, there was another system, kind of a reverse mechanism, a chain of mercy stretching back from the mud of the trenches, piece by bloody piece, toward the distant hope of home. That system was the Canadian Army Medical Corps, or the CAMC, and its ranks, from the lowest stretcher bearer to the highest general surgeon, were waging a war against death itself. They were not riflemen, yet they stood in the line of fire. They were not commanders, yet their decisions meant the difference between life and death. They were lifesavers in a war of destruction. Today, we journey back to the Canadian front line of the First World War to understand the monumental and often overlooked role of the Canadian Army Military Corps ranks. We'll follow the wounded soldier along the chain of evacuation and uncover the incredible innovations born from this industrial slaughter, and hear the haunting voices of the nurses and soldiers who bore witness to it all. Our research draws heavily from the essential historian Tim Cook and accounts from my third book in my Great War series, In Flanders' Shadow. As Tim Cook stated, the medical workers fought the real battle of the war, the battle against decay, disease, and death. End quote. So, the chain of evacuation from basically fire to the field. Imagine a soldier hit, a direct strike, shrapnel, or a bullet. His life depends entirely on a sequence of ranks, a protocol known as the chain of evacuation. This chain was the organizational genius of the Canadian Army Medical Corps. It began with the lowest and arguably bravest, the stretcher bearers. These men were often drawn from the infantry but medically trained, and they operated in the red zone. They wore the red cross on their armbands, a symbol of neutrality that was often ignored by enemy machine guns. Their job was to enter the trenches or the battlefields, often under continuous fire, stabilize the man, and carry him back. They were the bridge between fighting and the healing. The stretcher bearer was the first link in the chain of mercy. They carried men out of the mud and chaos, often under direct fire, with nothing but their strength and determination. A soldier's survival often depended upon the courage of those who had no weapon but a stretcher. Ralph Beverly Watson was born October 23rd, 1883 in Hull, England, to Joseph Watson and Lavinia Sanderson. Census records show him living in England before emigrating to Canada, where he settled in Ottawa, Ontario. In January 1915, he married Beulah Bonson, just months before enlisting in the Canadian Army Medical Corps on 25 May 1915. So he embarked for England aboard the troop ship SS Missanabie, if I've said that right, in July of 1915. And by February 1916, he was serving in France as a stretcher bearer. His role was perilous. Stretcher bearers moved across shell-torn landscapes, usually under fire, to carry the wounded back to aid posts. And Watson's own service file records multiple hospitalizations, the most serious being for gas poisoning, a common hazard in the trenches. Despite these injuries, he returned to duty and continued his work until the war's end. Watson's letters home, published in 1918 as Letters of a Canadian Stretcher Bearer, provide one of the most vivid accounts of medical service in the Great War. His words are direct and unsparing. And here's a quote from his book. "We had to crawl on our hands and knees with the stretcher, dragging it through the mud, shells bursting all around us. The cries of the wounded were terrible, but we could not stop." End quote. He was demobilized on February 3rd, 1919, returning to Canada after nearly 4 years of service. Watson's testimony remains invaluable. It's a rare Canadian voice from the medical chain of evacuation, showing the endurance and humanity of those who saved lives under fire. The job was brutally personal. Accounts from stretcher bearers frequently speak of the profound silence of finding a wounded man amidst the roar of guns, the quick, desperate work of stabilization, and then the agonizing haul back through the mud, where their own exhaustion was secondary to the wounded man's needs. They were the first link in the chain of mercy and the most vulnerable. For some stretcher bearers, the war was not only a physical burden, but a psychological one. In the archives of the Imperial War Museums in England, a voice still speaks. It belongs to Basil Farrer, a young man who enlisted in the Green Howards in 1913 and who would spend the First World War not with a rifle, but with a stretcher. Farrer's role was to carry the wounded from the battlefield. He served with the Royal Army Medical Corps, attached to ambulance trains and field ambulances, and later with the 2nd Battalion Green Howards in France. His recollections take us into the chaos of the Western Front and into the heart of human endurance. He was interviewed for the Imperial War Museums by Peter Hart 70 years after the first day of the Battle of the Somme, which was July 1st, 1916.
And my only recollection of that day is going backwards and forwards and picking up. And as you're going along with the stretcher, they're faint called stretcher bearer, wounded men. You'd go over, look on his shoulder. You're concerned with your own regiment. Sorry, chum, we're Yorks. Because if you're collected all and sundry back to your own regimental aid post, I mean, your medical officer had his hands full already with his own wounded. If you're going to take every wounded man back, they were strewn all over the shop like. It's hard to describe. Men all over on the floor, wounded.
As a stretcher bearer, Basil described the terror of crossing no man's land, unarmed, with only the weight of another man's body on his shoulders. His duty was not to kill, but to save, and yet it placed him directly in the line of fire. He remembered the exhaustion of carrying bodies through mud, the endless stream of casualties in field hospitals, and the haunting memories that never left him. Later, working in the Army Pay Corps, he reflected on the contrast between the front lines and the quieter, bureaucratic work behind them. A reminder that the war was fought both in trenches and in ledgers. In one point in his oral history interview with the Imperial War Museums, he was quoted as saying, "The bombardment hadn't cut the German wire. And as we went over, men were mown down by machine gun fire, one after another." End quote. So Basil Ferrer's voice matters because it humanizes the war. His testimony reminds us that courage is not only found in battle, but in compassion. Stretcher bearers face the same dangers as combat soldiers, but without weapons. Their bravery lay in the relentless act of saving lives. His fragmented recollections, sometimes clouded by emotion, show how memory itself carries the scars of war. Oral histories like his preserve not just the facts, but the feelings, the lived truth of conflict. So, through Basil's voice, we are reminded that the First World War was not only about generals and strategies, but about ordinary men who carried, who cared, and who endured. In Basil Ferrer's words, we hear not only the story of one man, but the echo of thousands. Memory and valor are intertwined. And through his testimony, we honor those whose courage was measured not in victories, but in lives saved. Frank Walker was born in 1893 on Prince Edward Island, here in Canada. Census records place him among a farming family before the war. In 1914, at just 21 years old, he enlisted in the Canadian Field Ambulance, part of the Canadian Army Medical Corps. Walker served from 1914 to 1919, and his journals reveal his presence at major battles, including the Third Battle of Ypres in June 1916, where he worked at advanced dressing stations near the infamous railway dugouts. His writings describe the relentless flow of casualties, the exhaustion of stretcher squads, and the grim silence after bombardments. Like Watson and Farr, Walker endured the dangers of frontline medical work. His journal entries and poems, later published as From a Stretcher Handle, blend stark diary notes with haunting verse. One of his most memorable lines reads, quote, "With desolation and the stars I lonely vigil keep, watching the dead men sleep, sprawled in the mud, wide staring at the sky." End quote. After the war, Walker returned to civilian life and pursued a career in journalism, eventually becoming a respected newspaper editor on Prince Edward Island. He lived until 1977, carrying the memory of his wartime service for more than 60 years. Walker's poetry captures the haunting silence after the battle, when bearers stood among the fallen, carrying not just bodies, but memories. Now, imagine the chaos of the battlefield, if you can. Mud, smoke, the crack of rifle fire. Amid it all, a wounded Canadian soldier is pulled from the front line, his uniform soaked, his breathing is shallow. He's not alone. Hands, steady and practiced, lift him onto a stretcher and begin the journey to the Regimental Aid Post, or RAP. The RAP isn't much to look at. It's cramped, it's dim, it's a bunker dug just behind the firing line. Sandbags, wooden beams, and the ever present scent of antiseptic and damp earth. Inside, a regimental medical officer, or an RMO, a Canadian doctor in uniform, part of the battalion, waits. His job? To do what he can with what little he has. Morphine for the pain, bandages for the bleeding, and a tag, one that quietly decides how urgent this man's wounds are. But the RMO doesn't work alone. Around him move the medical orderlies, non-commissioned men of the CAMC. They're the backbone of this operation. They organize the supplies, they scrub down the bloodied stretchers, and keep the place as clean as war will allow. Their work isn't glamorous, but it's vital. Without them, the system would collapse. So once stabilized, the soldier is moved again. Maybe by mule cart, maybe by field ambulance teams through shell-pocked roads. The next stop is the Casualty Clearing Station, or the CCS. This is where the real surgery happens. A few miles back from the trenches, but still close enough to hear the guns. Here, Canadian triage comes to life. Decisions made in minutes, lives saved or lost in the hands of surgeons working under fire. The Casualty Clearing Station was not a hospital in the traditional sense. Historian Tim Cook emphasizes the industrial nature of this stage. He wrote, "The CCS was not a hospital in the traditional sense. It was a factory of repair designed to process the highest volume of casualties in the shortest possible time. The Canadian doctors, working in shifts of 24 hours or more, became master practitioners of triage, determining in seconds who would live, who could wait, and who was already beyond their help." End quote. So, alongside this industrial efficiency was a human reality, the overwhelming tide of broken bodies. And as I wrote in Flanders Shadow, the sheer volume of human wreckage arriving at the CCS was terrifying. Every ambulance brought its fresh load of broken boys, and the doctors and nurses worked in a red haze of fatigue, never catching up, just perpetually fighting the tide of wounded. End quote. Together, these accounts reveal the dual nature of the CCS. It was both a lifeline and a crucible, a place where medicine met the machinery of war and where compassion was forced to operate under impossible strain. If a patient was stable enough, he continued his journey to the stationary hospitals and finally the general hospitals, which were located safely in the rear, often near the French coast or in Britain. This long, arduous journey, facilitated by a relentless system of medical ranks, was the greatest hope for survival in a war designated for annihilation. So now I'd like to read to you a bit from a book by Robert Graves. The book is called Goodbye to All That. Robert Graves served in World War I, and this section that I'm going to read to you talks about when he and his company were in High Wood, which was part of the Battle of the Somme. It took place in mid-July of 1916. And he was in charge of a company at that time. So I will just read to you a bit about his firsthand account. He says, the German batteries were handing out heavy stuff, 6 and 8 inch, and so much of it that we decided to move back 50 yards at a rush. As we did so, an 8-inch shell burst 3 paces behind me. I heard the explosion and felt as though I'd been punched rather hard between the shoulder blades, but without any pain. I took the punch merely for the shock of the explosion, but blood trickled into my eye, and, turning faint, I called to Moody, "I've been hit." Then I fell. A minute or two before I had got 2 very small wounds on my left hand, and exactly the same position as the 2 that drew blood from my right hand during the preliminary bombardment at Loos. One piece of shell went through my left thigh, high up, near the groin. I must have been at the full stretch of my stride to escape emasculation. The wound over the eye was made by a little chip of marble, possibly from one of the Byzantine cemetery headstones. Later, I had it cut out, but a smaller piece has since risen to the surface under my right eyebrow, where I keep it for a souvenir. This and a finger wound, which split to the bone, probably came from another shell bursting in front of me, but a piece of shell had also gone in 2 inches below the point of my right shoulder blade and came out through my chest 2 inches above the right nipple. My memory of what happened then is vague. Apparently, Dr. Dunn came up through the barrage with a stretcher party, dressed my wound, and got me down to the old German dressing station at the north end of Mametz Wood. I remember being put on the stretcher and winking at the stretcher bearer sergeant who had just said, "Old Gravy's got it all right." They laid my stretcher in the corner of the dressing station, where I remained unconscious for more than 24 hours. Late that night, Colonel Crawshay came back from High Wood and visited the dressing station. He saw me lying in the corner, and they told him I was done for. The next morning, July 21st, clearing away the dead, they found me still breathing and put me in an ambulance for Healy, the nearest field hospital. The pain of being jolted down the Happy Valley with a shell hole at every 3 or 4 yards of the road woke me up. I remember screaming. But back on the better roads, I became unconscious again. That morning, Crawshay wrote the usual formal letters of condolence to the next of kin of the 6 or 7 officers who had been killed. So he goes on to say basically that his colonel mistook his subconscious state for having passed away and actually wrote a letter of condolence to Graves's mother. At the same time, Graves had written a quick letter to his mother before he passed out yet again saying, "I'm wounded, but I'm okay." So poor Mrs. Graves is probably receiving this telegram from the colonel saying her son is dead and a letter from her son saying, "I'm wounded, but I'm okay." And the dates are maybe within a day or two of one another. So really, who knows? But evidently, Robert Graves did survive the war, and he wrote his memoirs. And this one, "Goodbye to All That," is probably one of the best ones out there. So continuing on with this whole subject, the battlefield didn't just break bodies; it rewrote the very nature of injury. Canadian medical teams trained in the traditions of civilian care suddenly faced wounds that no textbook had ever described. These weren't clean bullet holes or simple fractures. They were torn limbs, shredded flesh, and deep, festering trauma caused by the brutal force of modern artillery. Shrapnel didn't come alone. It brought mud, bits of uniform, and bacteria, all driven deep into the tissue. So infection became the true killer. Gas gangrene was swift and merciless, and it turned survivable wounds into death sentences. And yet, amid this horror, the Canadian Army Medical Corps didn't flinch. Its leaders, seasoned doctors and surgeons, knew they had to evolve and fast. But their breakthroughs didn't come from gleaming instruments and sterile labs. They came from the trenches, from trial and error, and from watching, learning, and adapting in real time. This was medicine under fire, innovation born in blood and urgency. So picture a dim, makeshift operating tent somewhere near the front lines. The air is thick with the smell of antiseptic and earth, and the ground beneath the surgeon's boots is slick with mud and blood. Canadian medical officers, exhausted but resolute, gather around a wounded soldier. They know what has to be done: debridement. It's not a word that comforts. It means cutting away every trace of dead or infected tissue, no matter how deep, no matter how painful. It is brutal, but it's the only way to stop gas gangrene from claiming another life. Nursing sisters, often working 24 or even 48-hour shifts, recorded the toll in their diaries, hands trembling from fatigue, eyes stinging from lack of sleep. They wrote of the smell, the relentless pace, and the quiet heroism of their colleagues. It wasn't glamorous and it wasn't easy, but it was necessary. These battlefield procedures, born of desperation and grit, would go on to shape modern trauma care. And in those blood-soaked tents, history was being rewritten, one limb, one life at a time. So we can talk here now a little bit about invisible wounds, because not every wound left blood or scars. For some men, the war lived inside them, shaking their nerves until they could no longer stand steady. Private Clarence Booth was just 23 years old when he enlisted with the 24th Battalion, the Victoria Rifles of Montreal. And by the spring of 1916, after months in the trenches near St. Eloi, the war had begun to take its toll. In his diary, Booth captured the moment when his resilience began to fray. He wrote simply, "Nerves starting to go bad," end quote. The bombardments had been relentless. The craters around him were filled with mud and death. And though he survived, something inside him was beginning to unravel. And it was evident in his diaries and his behavior. His hands trembled. His sleep was broken by nightmares. He felt his strength slipping away. Booth's words remind us that survival in the trenches was not only about escaping shells and bullets. It was about enduring the invisible wounds that followed. Private Clarence Booth's diary is a fragment of a lived experience, a reminder that the war's toll was measured not only in bodies, but in minds. And his words echo across time, capturing the moment when endurance gave way to fragility, when the human spirit itself was tested by war. The Canadian Army Medical Corps had begun to recognize this condition, what they then called shell shock. Unlike some armies that branded such men as cowards, Canadian doctors saw this collapse as an injury of the nervous system. At forward hospitals, they tried rest, hydrotherapy, and in some cases, talk therapy. For the Canadians, the goal was not punishment, but healing. And as historian Tim Cook observed in Lifesavers and Body Snatchers, he said, quote, "The sheer scale of the psychological trauma challenged the very definition of injury. The Canadian doctors understood that the collapse was physical, a breaking of the nervous system under impossible duress." End quote. So for Booth and thousands like him, the battle did not end when the guns fell silent. The orderlies who sat with trembling men, the nurses who offered quiet reassurance, and the doctors who experimented with new therapies All understood that these invisible wounds were as real as any shrapnel. Private Booth's diary is preserved at the Library and Archives Canada collection in Ottawa. It reminds us that the war was fought not only in mud and blood, but in the fragile space of the human mind. The Canadian Medical Corps, in their compassion and innovation, carried these men through battles that no one else could see. So, novel horrors, things like gas, trench foot, and trench fever, also were prolific and never seen before. Um, the medical crew were dealing with things they had never ever seen before, and so as a result, there were no cures, there were no treatments. And this is the innovation of the Canadian Army Medical Corps. And the innovation still persists into our medical system today. So the CAMC faced enemies that no textbook had ever prepared them for. The trenches themselves became a kind of predator. Cold, stagnant water seeped into boots, and men stood for days in mud that swallowed them to the knees, sometimes up to the thighs. From that mud came trench foot and trench fever, diseases that crippled thousands without a single bullet being fired. For the medical staff and nurses, the battle was relentless. They were forced into impossible choices: whether to cut away a soldier's rotting flesh in the hope of saving his life, or to amputate and end his suffering quickly. Each decision carried its own kind of heartbreak. And then the war changed again. One morning, soldiers looked up to see a strange green cloud drifting toward them. It was chlorine gas, the first of many chemical weapons that would redefine horror. Soon afterwards came mustard gas, blistering skin, burning eyes, and leaving men blind and broken. These attacks weren't just physical, they struck terror deep into the mind. The CAMC had to respond almost overnight, improvising treatments for wounds no one had ever seen before. They washed burned skin, bandaged eyes, and tried to calm men who could no longer breathe. In those moments, medicine itself was at war, fighting enemies that were invisible, insidious, and merciless. Mustard gas, which came after the chlorine gas, was unlike any enemy the Canadian Army Medical Corps had faced before. It did not kill outright. Instead, it lingered, seeping into uniforms and skin, leaving men with burns that blistered inside and out. Soldiers would stumble into aid posts blinded, coughing, their throats raw with fire. For the medical staff, the first moments were critical. Sanitation officers and orderlies had to strip away the contaminated clothing and wash the chemicals from the skin before they burned deeper. It was frantic, dangerous work. The gas clung to everything, and those who tried to save the wounded risked being poisoned themselves. Yet without that urgent decontamination, a soldier could lose his sight or his life. And the trenches bred other enemies too. Trench foot was slower, less dramatic, but no less cruel. Day after day, orderlies bent over rows of men, massaging and drying swollen feet, trying to halt the rot that crept in from the mud. It was monotonous and exhausting work, but it required patience and care. Each foot was tended with a small act of mercy against the trench's relentless assault. Soldiers often struggled to describe what it felt like to be gassed. One wrote that it was indescribable, like fire in the throat, eyes swelling shut, and the terrifying chorus of men choking and drowning on dry land. Particularly with the chlorine gas, it created this froth that would come up through the throat and out the mouth, and men would literally drown in their own fluids. The medical staff moved quickly, masked against the fumes, their hands steady even as chaos surrounded them. They couldn't stitch up gas burns or cut them out. Instead, they fought them with water, bandages, and compassion, soothing an agony they could not cure. In facing mustard gas and trench foot, the CAMC learned that the war demanded more than surgical skill. It required a chemical knowledge, relentless endurance, and above all, humanity. Their battle was not against an enemy they could see, but against suffering itself. So now moving on to another aspect of the medical part of this. A unique and vital rank within the CAMC was the nursing sister. Over 3,000 Canadian women served overseas. These women, they held the rank of nursing sister, which conferred the status of lieutenant or captain, a monumental achievement for women in uniform at the time. This rank was essential, though, not just for respect, but for their function. They were not merely healers, they were administrators, commanding their wards, managing complex logistical supply chains, and demanding strict sanitation standards. And in some cases, this was often on the move, depending on where the line was. They brought order and discipline to a place designed for chaos, earning them immense respect among the men and the medical officers alike. They were also the backbone of the casualty clearing stations and general hospitals. Their job description went far beyond clinical care. They were the guardians of humanity in an inhumane environment. The sheer volume of work they managed was staggering. So they oversaw sanitation, organized all those supplies, and provided the relentless day-to-day care that prevented infection and hastened recovery. So it was at the casualty clearing stations where the different ranks coalesced. The surgeons, often holding the rank of major or lieutenant colonel, who performed life-saving amputations and exploratory surgery, the anesthetists who struggled with the antiquated equipment and contaminated ether, and the nurses, the angels of the CCS, whose presence provided the first semblance of civilian life the men had seen since the front. The Canadian nursing sisters, nicknamed Bluebirds for their uniforms, were the backbone of this medical system. They worked in casualty clearing stations just miles from the front and often under shell fire. Nursing sister Helen Kendall was born in Sydney, Nova Scotia in 1892. She was the daughter of Dr. Henry Ernest Kendall and Ida Burchell. Her father was a respected physician who himself would serve in the First World War, and her family's sense of duty ran deep. Helen grew up in Cape Breton, surrounded by the sea and the close-knit community of Sydney, before moving to Montreal to study surgical nursing at the prestigious Royal Victoria Hospital. She graduated in December 1916, just as the war was reaching its most brutal years. Within weeks, Helen enlisted with the Canadian Army Medical Corps in Halifax. By early 1917, she was in England, and soon after serving in France as a nursing sister and anesthetist. She was one of nearly 3,000 Canadian women who donned the blue uniform and veil. Her letters and recollection reveal the stark reality of her work. She described it as, quote, nasty work, but necessary. We cleaned wounds that no one should ever have to see, and we did it because those boys needed us, end quote. In casualty clearing stations, often under shell fire, she tended to shattered bodies and broken spirits. And Helen's courage didn't go unnoticed. She was awarded the Royal Red Cross Class II, one of only 446 Canadians who have received this honor. After the war, she continued her service, even returning during the Second World War. She lived a long life, passing away in 1985 at the age of 93, carrying with her the memories of two wars and the countless men she cared for. Helen Kendall's story is not just one of service, but of resilience. She stood at the edge of battlefields, armed not with a weapon, but with compassion and skill. Her life reminds us that valor is not only found in the trenches, but also in the quiet, relentless work of healing. John Palmer was a British gunner who served as a signaller with the Royal Field Artillery between 1914 and 1917. Presented again in 2017 by Dan Snow of the BBC, John Palmer was originally interviewed in 1963 by Peter Hart, who was an oral historian with the Imperial War Museums, and this was presented by the BBC for the Great War series. He told of his experience after being wounded at Third Ypres, also known as the Battle of Passchendaele.
And then I found myself being bumped about, and I realised that I was on a stretcher, and I thought, poor devils, these stretcher bearers, I wouldn't be a stretcher bearer for anything. And then something else happened. I suddenly realised that I wasn't dead. I realised that I was alive. I realised that if these wounds didn't prove fatal, that I should get back to my parents, to my sister, to the girl that I was going to marry, the girl that had sent me a letter every day, practically from the beginning of the war. Then, the dressing station, morphia, and I must then have had that sleep that I so badly needed, for I didn't recollect any more until I found myself in a bed with white sheets, and I heard the lovely, wonderful voices of our nurses, English, Scotch, and Irish, and I think then I completely broke down.
The diaries and letters from the nursing sisters consistently reveal their dual role: clinical professional and emotional anchor. They understood their duty extended beyond dressings and charts. They were there to fan the smallest flicker of hope into a wounded man's eyes. They were the ones who wrote the last letters, offered the joke, and provided the first familiar sign of humanity and home the men had seen since leaving the front. But the presence of nursing sisters also brought complex dynamics into the medical ranks. As officers, they commanded respect, but they also faced incredible emotional stress. Tim Cook explored this tension. Quote, "The nurses were professional yet intensely compassionate. They were expected to be stoic, to witness unimaginable suffering without showing weakness. They saw men that the doctors and surgeons had only seen on the operating table. They saw them through the days and nights of fever, despair, and often death. Their rank was high, but their emotional cost was higher still." End quote. In my third book, In Flanders' Shadow, I highlight the inner struggle of the medical professionals as they fought to maintain their empathy amidst the constant carnage. Quote, "To survive Flanders, the medical staff built an inner wall, but they couldn't afford to be numb. They had to feel enough to care, to save a life, but not so much that the grief paralyzed the surgeon's hand or the nurse's duty." End quote. So the nurses often acted as a filter for the raw brutality and the reality of the front, protecting the wounded men from the administrative indifference and even shielding the surgeons from the full emotional weight of their work. They became kind of like the ultimate moral compass of the Canadian Army Medical Corps. Their duty, it was relentless, their compassion was unshaken, even in the face of unimaginable suffering. Though they were called angels, the nurses themselves often felt more like soldiers. The Canadian nursing sisters were often called angels, but in truth they saw themselves differently. As one nurse recalled in an oral history preserved at the Canadian War Museum, quote, "We were called angels, but we felt more like soldiers with bandages instead of rifles. End quote. It's a striking metaphor capturing the duality of that role. Healers in spirit, yet fighters in resolve. They stood at casualty clearing stations and field hospitals, braving the same dangers as the men they cared for. Veterans Affairs Canada pays tribute to their resilience, noting, quote, they braved all the hardships of war to do their duty and care for their patients, often under shell fire, with humor as well as anguish. End quote. Their courage was not only in tending wounds, but in sustaining morale when hope seemed lost. In the darkest hours, they carried not just bandages, but the strength to remind broken soldiers that they were not forgotten. They were the quiet sentinels of the war, the Canadian nurses of the CAMC. No rifles slung over their shoulders, no medals for gallantry in combat. But they stood closer to death than most soldiers ever knew. At the forward casualty clearing stations, they worked under fire. The thunder of artillery was constant. The threat of long-range shell fire was never far. And yet they stayed, tending to the broken, the burned, the barely breathing. They were more than a rank. They were the soul of the medical corps, the ones who whispered comfort when the morphine ran out, the ones who steadied the hands of surgeons and who reminded the wounded that they were still human. And then came Etaple. It was supposed to be a place of safety. It was a sprawling hospital base in northern France, far enough from the front to offer rest, recovery, and a moment of peace. But on the night of May 19th, 1918, that illusion shattered. German aircraft descended on Etaple with brutal precision. Bombs rained down on the hospital complex. One struck the nurses' quarters of Number 1 Canadian General Hospital. Among the wounded was nursing sister Edith Alberta Gallagher, a young woman from Bathurst Township, Ontario. She'd come to France not for glory, but to serve. That night, she was pulled from the rubble, injured but alive. Other nurses were not so lucky. 3 Canadian nurses were killed. Dozens of patients died in their beds. The war diary recorded it in stark terms. Quote, the hospital was wrapped in slumber when the planes were immediately overhead. End quote. But Edith's story didn't end in that cratered ward. She recovered and she returned to duty. Her courage, like that of so many others, was quiet, steadfast, and unshakable. She didn't seek recognition. She simply went back to work. Because for her and for the women of the Canadian Army Medical Corps, care was not a calling, it was a conviction. Their sacrifice is etched into Canadian memory, not just in medals or monuments, but in the lives they saved, and the hands they held, and the legacy they left behind. So the tragedy of the trenches forced medicine to evolve at a pace never, ever seen before. Necessity became the mother of invention, and the CAMC, working alongside their Commonwealth allies, turned the front lines into a crucible of innovation. Out of mud, blood, and desperation came breakthroughs that still shape trauma care today. So I'm pretty excited to be talking about this section in the podcast because here we are talking about innovation and invention medically that came out of this great war. And the reason for my excitement is these ones that I'm going to highlight now were born out of Canadian innovation. And first thing I want to talk about is blood transfusions at the front. It was one of the most important breakthroughs of the war, and it didn't come from a lab, but from the front lines. And when we think of blood transfusions, I mean, this is sort of a commonplace concept in terms of hospital use, not just in Canada or the US, or it's global. And it was born from the mind of a Canadian. So let's talk about that. So before the Great War, blood transfusions were rare. They were almost experimental. Doctors performed them arm to arm, one donor to one patient in a delicate, sort of time sensitive dance. But that method couldn't keep up with the carnage of the Western Front. Honestly, men were bleeding out faster than help could arrive, so something had to change. And it did, thanks to Canadian medical pioneers. They discovered that by adding sodium citrate, blood wouldn't clot. It could be stored, transported, and chilled. So suddenly, type O blood, which is the universal donor, could be kept on hand at field ambulances and casualty clearing stations, ready to be used at a moment's notice. For the first time, surgeons had a real weapon against hemorrhagic shock. They could buy time, they could save lives. It wasn't just a medical advance, it was a revolution. One born not in theory, but in urgency, in the muddy, blood soaked corners of France, where innovation meant survival. And again, as historian Tim Cook wrote in Lifesavers and Body Snatchers, quote, before this, a soldier bleeding out on the table was almost certainly lost. With stored blood, the Canadian surgeons could fight the clock, giving them precious minutes to stabilize and operate. The CAMC pioneered the concept of the blood depot, a military rank of its own, which became the foundation for all modern blood banking. End quote. One of the earliest and most powerful stories of transfusion saving a life on the battlefield comes from Canadian surgeon Major Lawrence Bruce Robertson, who'd used the technique to rescue a soldier on the brink of death in 1915. So let's kind of set the scene here. Just imagine the soldier was fading fast. It was October 1915, and the casualty had just arrived at the forward medical station. He's pale, he's cold, and barely conscious. He had lost too much blood, and the usual treatments of morphine, bandages, hope weren't enough. He was slipping away. But Major Robertson, a Canadian surgeon serving with the British forces, had an idea. He had trained in New York and Boston, where he'd studied a new technique, blood transfusion. It was risky and unproven, but it was all he had. So, using a syringe and tubing, Robertson drew blood from a healthy donor and transferred it directly into the wounded man's veins. It was crude and it was delicate, but it worked. And the soldier's color returned, his pulse steadied, and he lived. That moment, quiet, improvised, and extraordinary, marked a turning point. Robertson's success proved that transfusion wasn't just possible in wartime, it was essential. He went on to perform dozens more, refining the technique and training others. So his work laid the foundation for modern blood banking and battlefield resuscitation. In the chaos of war, one man's life was saved not by firepower but by innovation. And from that single act of courage, thousands more would follow. So now I'd like to talk about the idea of triage and what they called the Carroll Dakin solution. This is interesting because really war doesn't wait, and neither could medicine. So on the battlefields of France, Canadian medical teams faced a relentless tide of wounded men, each one a life hanging in the balance. There wasn't time for hesitation. So they created something revolutionary at the time, triage. It was a system born of necessity, a way to sort the wounded not by rank or arrival, but by urgency and chance of survival. So, who needed surgery now? Who could wait? Who, heartbreakingly, wouldn't make it? These decisions were made in seconds, often under fire, and they saved lives. Today, that system, refined in the mud and blood of the Western Front, is used in every emergency room around the world. But triage was only part of the innovation. Infection was a silent killer. Even if a soldier survived the blast, bacteria could finish the job and often did. So Canadian doctors turned to chemistry. They used what they called the Carroll-Dakin solution. It's a simple mix of diluted sodium hypochlorite to irrigate deep wounds. It wasn't glamorous, it smelled like bleach, but it worked. Amputations dropped. Deaths from infection plummeted. In the trenches, this humble chemical wash was as vital as any scalpel. It was battlefield medicine at its finest, practical, urgent, and profoundly human. So moving on, imagine a field ambulance unit just miles from the front, equipped with an X-ray machine. Canadian ingenuity made it possible. Mobile X-rays allowed surgeons to locate shrapnel and bullets before cutting, reducing operating time and saving limbs. Precision replaced guesswork, and countless men walked again because of it. For most of the war, a broken thigh bone was a death sentence. The femur is the largest bone in the body, and when it shattered under shell fire or shrapnel, the jagged ends tore arteries and muscle. Men would bleed out before they ever reached a surgeon. Mortality rates hovered around 80%. But then came the Thomas splint. One Canadian private, wounded near Passchendaele in 1917, was struck by shrapnel that snapped his femur. Would have been an absolutely awful injury. His stretcher bearers knew immediately what that meant. Without intervention, he would almost certainly bleed to death before reaching the casualty clearing station. They didn't wait to lift him straight onto the stretcher. Right there in the mud, they improvised a splint with whatever they could find. A bayonet, a rifle, even scraps of wood. Anything that could hold the leg rigid and straight and keep the broken bone ends from grinding together and severing arteries during the long, jolting journey back. It was crude, but it worked. And by the time he reached the surgeons, he was still alive. Pale, weak, but alive. In that moment, the stretcher bearer's quick thinking and resourcefulness had made the difference between life and death. The surgeons stabilized him, transfused stored blood to fight shock, and operated with precision, aided by the new mobile X-ray units. Weeks later, he's walking with crutches. He had survived what just a year earlier would have been a fatal wound. Stories like his were repeated across the Canadian Expeditionary Force. The Thomas splint, combined with blood transfusions and X-rays, transformed survival rates. Mortality for femur fractures dropped from 80% to less than 20%. It was one of the single most effective interventions of the war. And it was carried out not by surgeons in operating theaters, but by stretcher bearers and regimental medical officers in the mud of the front lines. Canadian medical ranks entered the war armed with 19th century knowledge. They emerged with practices that would define 21st century trauma medicine. From the stretcher bearers who knew the urgency of rapid transport to the colonel surgeon who pioneered radical new procedures, they transformed military medicine. Out of tragedy came innovation, and from innovation came survival. So at the end of the day, the quiet legacy is this. The Canadian Army Medical Corps paid dearly for its service. 248 were killed in action and more than 700 wounded. Yet their dedication transcended the brutality that surrounded them. They walked through the worst of humanity and in doing so revealed some of its very best. It was these ranks who systematized the evacuation chain, who gave women officer status in the field, and who laid the foundation of modern trauma medicine. Every time blood is transfused in an emergency room, every time a nurse steadies a patient, and every time a surgeon cleans and saves a wound, they're following practices first forged in the mud of Flanders. We remember the names of the battles, Vimy, Passchendaele, the Somme, but we must also remember the names of the healers. The stretcher bearers, the nurses, the surgeons, the orderlies, they stood against the machinery of destruction, and through intelligence, tenacity, and compassion, they saved lives on an industrial scale. The First World War was a national tragedy, a wound that scarred Canada deeply. Yet within that darkness, the light of the Canadian Medical Corps shone. Their chain of mercy remains one of Canada's most profound and enduring gifts to the world, proof that even in war, humanity can triumph. So, as we close this episode of Memory and Valour, I want to return once more to the memory of Dr. Cook. At just 54 years old, his passing leaves a silence in Canadian history that will be deeply felt. Through his work at the Canadian War Museum and in his books, he gave us history that was not distant but alive, personal, compelling, and grounded in the voices of those who lived it. He reminded us that remembrance is not only about dates and battles, but about people, their courage, and their humanity. So this episode is dedicated to Tim Cook, guardian of memory, teller of truths, and a historian whose words will continue to inspire long after his own voice has fallen quiet. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you'd like to explore the service records and photographs related to this episode, you can find them on the website at www.memoryandvalour.ca. As we look ahead, the story becomes more personal. In our next episode, remembrance will no longer be distant history. It will be family. I'll trace the steps of my own great-grandfather and his nephew as they climbed the ridge at the Battle of Hill 70. Hill 70, it was a place of fire and gas where machine gun nests cut down entire companies and counterattacks came in wave after wave. Hill 70 was one of Canada's fiercest and most costly victories, a battle that tested not only strategy but the endurance of every man who fought there. It is also, sadly, labeled as Canada's forgotten victory. For my great-grandfather and his nephew, it was a crucible of survival. Did they endure the storm or fall to it? Their fate on that ridge is a story I have carried all my life. And the next time, I'll share it with you. So until then, keep history alive, for where memory endures, valor lives on.